Okay, so before I get started with Journal 68, I do want to mention that this journal is a white packet. So if you need that packet, there are extra copies in my classroom. So feel free to come to me to grab some. But you could just write all of this information in your notebook. I'm just saying that it is a lot of writing. So keep that in mind. If you just want to get that packet and then stick it in your journal, you are more than welcome to do that. All right, let's get started with Journal 68. So we are going to be talking about how to make 3 different types of graphs today. We're going to be talking about how to make a frequency table, how to make a pie chart, and how to make a histogram, which is a type of bar graph that has no gaps. But let's start with the frequency table. So whenever we have data that we've collected, we need to organize it in some sort of form. So a frequency table is a great method to use so we can observe some sort of pattern or some sort of way we can summarize our data. So the thing is, with the frequency table, you are looking at your tallying up your observation. I guess that's the best way to put it. So if you look at your page 2 of this packet, you're going to get a list of numbers. And what we do is, with that list of numbers, we don't want to tally each individual number. Instead, we are going to group up the list of numbers into what we call class intervals, okay? And so to create that class interval, we have a formula to do that with. And what you do, so if you have a list of numbers, you are going to take the biggest number or the biggest value in that list and subtract it by the smallest number in that list. And if you remember this, this is also the same formula for calculating the range, right? You always take your biggest number and subtract it by your smallest number to get your range. However, when you're trying to find the class interval or the width of the size of the interval, you also divide this by the number of classes. And what that means is, what the number of classes means is like, how big do you want your size of your interval to be? So classes is like the size of, or like how, not the size, I take that back. It is the number of intervals you want. So put that in commas. And I'll show you what this means when we get to the next slide, when we're using our example. So class intervals tell us how big or how much space we should get each interval, okay? Frequency is the number of times a value occurs, and relative frequency is the percentage. So let me write this down first and I'll explain it. So the percentage of individual pieces compared to the whole. So the percentage of individual pieces compared to the whole. What that means is, let's give you an example. So let's say I was looking at one class, and so in my classroom, I counted up how many people are in my classroom, so the total number of students. And I want to find the percentage of people in my classroom that have blue eyes. So I would count up how many people have blue eyes and then divide it by the total number of people in that classroom. And that gives me a percentage. But that percentage there is only specific towards blue eyes, or in other words, that specific individual group. And we compare that to the entire class, or the whole. So relative frequency talks about a specific group's percentage compared to the whole. Whereas cumulative, so let's write that definition for cumulative frequency. So it's the percentage of the whole added multiple groups together. And what that means there is, sometimes You might want to know percentages, maybe several groups percentages together. Like for example, let's say I didn't just want to know about the blue eyes percentage, I want to also know the brown eyes. So if I were to ask, what is the percentage of brown eyes and blue eyes? Well, then I would add those percentages together to get something called a cumulative frequency. So a cumulative frequency is when you add several groups together to get that percentage. All right, so we're going to do an example here in the next slide. So here's our first example. I have a list of test scores here. So these are test scores obtained from a class, and I did list them in order. If they weren't listed in order, I would have to put them in order. So keep that in mind when you're doing your project. You might have to order them first before you try to make a graph. So we need to first determine the class intervals. Okay, the class interval size or width, to create our frequency table. But they do give us the total number of classes to use, and that's 8. So if you remember from the first slide, to calculate that class interval, the size for that is taking the biggest value or the upper value and subtracting it from the lower value. So the biggest value here is 95. Whereas the smallest value here is 35. So I would take 95 and subtract it with 35, and I would divide it by the number of classes that I choose. And so the classes that they choose to use is 8. And by the way, I just want you to realize this, that classes, I'm not talking about classroom classes. Classes is another word in statistics for how many intervals. So anytime you hear the word classes, it's talking about the number of intervals or the number of groups. So like take a look at this frequency table here that's already been pre-made, but it's a little bit incomplete. Notice how many rows there are in this frequency table. So count. When I count up the number of rows, there are 8 rows. So that tells me I should have 8 groups here, or 8 intervals. And so this problem has already determined that there are 8. This is something that a person would choose. So when you're doing your project, you're going to need to choose the number of classes to use or the number of intervals you want. So this problem just chose it to be 8. So if you work out this problem, 95 minus 35 is, I believe, 60. And if you divide that by 8, it's about 7.5. Here's the thing, though. There's a little small note here that says that once you find the class width, which is what we just did, you have to round up. So no matter what your decimal value is, you will always need to round up. So if you were to round this, you would have 8. By the way, if you've never seen this squiggly line, squiggly equal sign, it just means approximately, or when you round, you use this equal sign to say that it's approximately 8 or about 8. So if you have a decimal number, you always round up. So even if this was 7.1, you would still round up, no matter how small. The only time you don't have to round up if it was 7.0, and that was it. Then it could stay at 7. So my class interval size is 8, so that means within an interval, I should have 8 digits. And let me explain what this means here. So now let's take a look at our frequency table. So let me zoom this in for us so that way we can see. Okay, I think that's good. If I need to zoom in more, I'll do that later. Maybe I can bring this down just a little bit. Okay, that's way better. All right, so looking at this here, we're going to start with how they got the class width here, where they made the individual intervals here. So if you notice the intervals, I want you to ignore this right-hand side and just focus in on the left-hand side of the interval first. So the first number will always be the number you have on your list, the lowest number. So the lowest number here, the smallest number here is 35, so you're going to start with 35. To get your next number on the left-hand side, you always add by the class interval or by your width size. So our width size is 8. So that means that every time I jump down to the next number, I have to add 8. So 35 plus 8 is going to give me 43. And if I add another 8 to this, I'm going to get 51, 59, 67, 75, 83, and 91. That's how they got the numbers on the left-hand side, is that they started with the smallest number on the list, and then they added the width size. On this side is basically the number that it continues from. So notice how this number here is a 43. Well, the number behind 43 is 42, because you want the intervals to continue each other. So like after 35 to 42, it should be 43 to 50, and then it continues to 51 to 58. You see? So you would keep going until you have all your intervals. In this case, it wanted 8 classes, so there are 8 intervals here. I also want to mention how the interval of each one are the same size. They should be a size of 8 digits. So let's just use 35 to 42 as an example. So I want you to count with your fingers and count out the numbers 35 to 42. So 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. That is 8 digits right there on my fingers. So each one of these intervals will be 8 digits or 8 numbers between. So this is how you can find the tallies. Sorry about that intercom. So we're going to tally up the numbers in between 35 and 42. So looking at your list, since it's in order now, look for numbers and see if you can find numbers between 35 and 42. Well, the only numbers between 35 and 42 is 35, right? 48 is not between that interval. So 35 is the only number, so I would put 1 tally and 1 for the frequency, because I only have 1 tally. And I would do this again for my other intervals. So let's try to do a 67 to 74. So numbers between 67 and 74 are going to be 68, 70, and I think that's it. So that's 2 numbers. So I'm going to put 2 tallies and then 2 here. Sorry for those bells. All right, so let's complete this column, these 2 columns here. So for this one, 75 to 82, 78 will count, 79 will count, 80 will count. And so that is 5 right there, 5 digits from the list that we see in that interval. 83 to 90, so if I look at this list again, 83 and 90, 85, 88, 88, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That is 4 digits in our list that are in that interval. And last but not least, numbers between 91 and 98 are going to be 91, 95, and 95. And so that is 3 digits right there, so that is going to be 3 for our frequency. All right, so that's how you can find your frequency, is basically tally up the numbers within that interval. Let's talk about relative frequency next. So to find the relative frequency, or that percentage for an individual interval or group, what you have to do is take your frequency and divide it by the number of terms you have. So if you count up the number of terms on this list, there are 20 terms, okay? So that means I take my frequency, here's a 1, or let's use the one that they just used. So 1 is my frequency, so I'm going to do 1 divided by the total terms. So that's going to be 20. So 1 divided by 20 gives you 0.05. So you can do that in the calculator or by hand. The next one here is also a frequency of 1. So I'm going to divide that by 20 again and get 0.05 or 5%. The next one is 2 frequency of 2 and divide that by 20, that is 0.10 if you put that in the calculator. And again, it's another 2 for the frequency, so if I divide, I get 0.10. And same for the next. And then I get to 5 divided by 20. If you put that in the calculator, you get 0.25. 4 divided by 20 is 0.2, or 20%. And 3 divided by 20 is 0.15, or 15%. And that's how you get your relative frequency. Cumulative frequency is a little bit trickier, but it's actually not very hard. What you do is you look in the first row here. So if this is the first row, you need to grab the total amount in this first row. So this first row is 0.05 for the frequency, so this is also going to be 0.05, or 5%. Now, once you get to the second row, like right here, instead of just taking this row, you have to take both of the rows and add them. So if you're in the second row, you add 2 of the rows together. So if you add 0.05 with 0.05, you get 0.10, or 0.10. If you're on the third row, you're going to add 3 of the rows now. So if you add 0.05 with 0.05 and 0.10, you get 0.20. If you're on the fourth row, you're going to have to add 4 of the rows. So if you add these 4, you get 0.30. And then if you add the 5 rows, you get, because you're in the fifth row, you get 0.4, or 0.40. If you take the next row, which is the 6, add it with all 6 rows here, you get 0.65. I hope you guys are noticing a pattern, but a quick way you can also add is always take the number here on the right hand side and add it with the number diagonal from it. So if you take 0.4 and add it with 0.25, you get 0.65. So if you take 0.65, add it with 0.2, you get 0.8. That's just a faster way you can add and get your cumulative frequency. And last but not least, oh, sorry, I think I dropped a 5 here. It should have been 85. My bad. Because 0.65 added with 20 gives you 0.85. And now if you take 0.85 and add it with 15, you get actually, you would just get 1. Right? 15 plus 85 is going to be, 0.85 added with 0.15 is going to give you 1. Because when you add up all your percentages, you should get 1, because 1 represents 100%. So the cumulative frequency is basically for you guys to check whether you did the class width right and the rest of the frequency table correctly in order to add up to 100%. So it's a great way to check yourselves and whether you did this table correctly. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is build that pie chart. To build a pie chart, you need to use the relative frequency to do it. So I'm now going to zoom this out just a tidbit. There we go. We're just going to need that frequency table and that pie chart. Scoot this over just a little bit. I feel like it's a little tilted. Okay, so what we're going to do here is take our relative frequency, because pie charts, so the thing about pie charts I probably should write, they use the relative frequency to create the proportions that you see on a pie chart. So what I like to do first, if I have like a circle or a pie, I guess you could call, I like to split it up into some portion that I'm familiar with so I can work around it. So one that I really like to use is cutting it into fourths. So that means I'm just going to, let me scoot this over a little bit. Yeah. So cutting it basically up and down and then sideways so that each piece is worth about 25%, right? So what I like to do is take a look at my relative frequency and pick out the numbers that represent very close to 25% or is 25%. So notice how like the interval 75 to 82 is 25%. So in that case, I can say that this piece here, let me use darker, this piece right here, I'm going to designate that piece to be interval 75 to 82. And if you like to be extra, you can also say that this is 0.25 or 25%. Okay? So sometimes people like to put in parentheses how much percent that is or how much is the piece worth to the whole. Just so that they, especially if you're bad at drawing a portion, you might want to say that specifically that's that size. But make sure you label what interval that represents. So now I'm going to pick another piece, like maybe 83 to 90 is about 20%. So if it's about 20% here, grab this. If it's 20%, it's about this piece right here, but just like a small chunk of it cut off, right? Because this whole piece here is 25%, but a small piece of it I'm going to chop off so that this piece right here represents that 20% for this interval. So I'm going to use this piece right here to represent the interval 83 to 90, and that specifically is going to be for 20%. Now, if I already took up 20% of this, that means this little piece right here has to represent 5%. So I'm going to look for something that is 5% on my relative frequency, such as this one here. So that interval is 35 to 42. So in here, I'm going to write this as 35 to 42. And I won't write the percentage there just because I can't really fit it very well. So this piece right here is going to be for that small portion. Now, since I now know what 5% looks like on the pie chart, I'm going to replicate it because I have another one that's also 5%. So I might as well knock that one out. So from 43 to 50, it's also 5%. So I'm going to try to make this size the same amount as the previous slice, since they're both 5%. So this is going to be 43, to 50. All right, let's see what else do we have next. If I took about 5% off of this 25%, that means that this portion right here is worth 20%. So since I have so many 10% here, right? This is 10% from 51 to 58. I might as well just use this piece right here and split it up into twos to make that 20% into two 10%. So this portion here is going to designate for that 51 to 58 because it's worth 10%. And this portion, maybe I'll designate it for that that 59 to 66 because it's also 10%. All right, so now I'm just left with these two intervals. So this one here is also 10%, so I know what the size of a 10% looks like now. I'm going to try to replicate this slice to look about the same size as these here. So let's just say that this is about 10%. And so this piece here is going to be for 67 to 74. So now I've knocked down these two. And now I just have this one left, which is 15%, which is perfect because this spot here is worth 25%. If I already took off 10% of it, that means this piece right here is worth 15%. So from 91 to 98, this is worth 15%. And there we have it. We have used the full pie chart here and given each interval its own designation or own portion size. All right, the next thing we're going to do is make that histogram. So the last thing we haven't created yet is a histogram. So a histogram is basically a bar graph I'll write this to the side here. Bar graph with no gaps in between, and it displays the frequency. Okay, so what we have to do to make our bar graph here is first probably look at our frequency and the range of our frequency. So if you look at this frequency column here, it is between, the smallest number is 1, whereas the biggest number on here is 5. So you typically will graph your frequency on the y-axis. So because this is like 1 through 5, I'm just going to make some tally marks here to represent all of them. I think I'll go up to 6 just so I have a little extra room at the top. You don't have to, you can go all the way up just to 5, but I like to go to 6, or like 1 number extra. And then on the bottom portion here, the x-axis, you're going to label your class width, okay? And so if you looked here and remember from the beginning, there were 8 classes or 8 intervals. So you have to make sure that there are 8 intervals here, or 8 bars. So to do this, I'm just going to cut this up to 8s. So that is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this here is going to represent from 35 to 42. And so from 35 to 42, there was only one number that showed up. So I am going to draw a bar graph that only goes up to 1. Whereas the next one here is from 43 to 50. And it also only had 1 as the frequency. So I'm also going to draw this to 1. I'll do a different color here just so that you guys can see the difference, that this is a different bar. Might be something nice to do when you make your own during the project. So the next interval is between 51 to 58, and that is also, actually 51 to 58 is up to 2 for the frequency. Do that a little better. And then the next one here is from 59 to 66. My numbers are getting crunched up. It's just because my handwriting is a little bit big for this. It's also a frequency of 2. Next one here is 67 to 74, which also has a frequency of 2. And from 75 to 82, I have 5 that showed up, or my frequency is 5. And then 83 to 90, and I'll just write in the last one, which is 91 to 98. So for 83 to 90, there were 4. So to go all the way up to 4, I'll do that in green. And the last one had 3 as the frequency, so all the way up to 3. And there we have it. Notice how our histogram here has no gaps between the bars, and there are 8 bars here, right, for 8 of the intervals or 8 of the classes that we chose in the beginning. When you are making your project, you need to decide on how many classes you're going to choose. And the more classes you have, or the more intervals you have, the more bars you're going to have on your graph. So keep that in mind. If you're only showing 2 bar graphs, 2 bars on your bar graph, it's not going to be very detailed. So keep that in mind. And if you need suggestion on what to make your size of your classes, please ask me. I will give you a recommended number. I also like to mention we're not quite done yet because we have forgotten the labels on this histogram. So let's zoom into this histogram here and put some labels on here. So the bottom here is talking about the test scores, right? These are all the different types of test scores you can have. And so that unit is in percentage. Whereas the y-axis is talking about the number of students who took the test, or the frequency. So the number of students, we'll just say, to keep this nice and short. You don't have to write a title for this histogram on your project, just because the title should be the title of your research. You should have a title for that anyways. So this title could be like test scores, but like I said, you don't need a title for your histogram on your project, because your project should have a title. All right, so I hope this helps a little bit with the project. So you just learned how to make 3 different graphs: a frequency table, a pie chart, and a histogram. So on the project, you should be showing me these 3 items on your display. I also want to mention there's another example in the packet, example 2. I won't do that with you guys because that would take me extra time. But for your own extra practice, I would highly recommend to do that. And when you turn in your journals, I'm going to be grading that anyways. So if you want to look at the answers for that example 2, feel free to check out the Google Classroom for Journal 68, the completed version. I have the answers there, but I do want you guys to try out the problem on example 2 yourself first. All right, that's it for Journal 68.